Who's our former student here at the Nationalism Studies program. I'm Szabolcs Pogonyi, head of the Nationalism Studies program at CEU Vienna. As you probably know, the university was persecuted out of the country. We still have the buildings and some activities here, but most of the university is in Vienna. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our last speaker today, Pieter Judson, who needs very little introduction. I guess all of you who study nationalism from different disciplines and perspectives are still familiar with Pieter Judson's name and also work. Pieter is a professor at the European University Institute in Florence, where he, until 2024, was also the chair in 19th and 20th century history in the same institute, the EUI in Florence. Pieter's primary focus in his historical works is the Habsburg Empire and Central Europe, and his most important contributions to the field of nationalism, as I see it, and I may well be wrong, is about the construction of nationalities in the Habsburg Empire, and particularly on the boundaries, the borders, the fringes of the Habsburg Empire, and the competing nationalisms and imperial discourses. Pieter authored dozens of very important articles in this field and also books. Let me just mention one that is very important for, probably not only for me, but also for most of us, students and scholars in this field of nationalism studies, which is The Guardians of the Nation from 2006. This is a book that I use as a reference book, so I'm very biased towards it. This is one of my favorite historical books that discusses the creation of national identity from multiple perspectives, discussing how states try to impose or create a sense of national identity through different projects, policies, and initiatives, and also how individuals respond, challenge, or contest such efforts by the state. It's a fantastic book. It's an historical book, but it's also a sociologically informed book that looks into the development of national identities with a sociological sensitivity, which is just, I think it's a great achievement. Let me also finally mention another concept that Pieter Judson contributed a lot to in his scholarship, the concept of national indifference, which is, again, another concept that many of us use in the study of nationalism and the creation of nationalities, national identities, a concept that comes originally from historians as an analytical concept, but was also borrowed by sociologists, which is, I think, the biggest acknowledgement of a scientific concept. That is, it's being used all across disciplines by scholars who come from very different methodological perspectives and use different scholarships. So without further ado, Pieter, the floor is yours. The presentation, the title of today's presentation will be Territorializing the Nation in Habsburg Central Europe.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. It's now been actually 20 years since that book came out, and I think if the strategy, national indifference, and it meant many different things to those of us who first talked about it, if it still has any meaning, I think it's because the field was so overdetermined by other ways of thinking about nationhood that many of us were trying to find a way out of that kind of thinking, and I guess if it's useful today, it would probably be for the same reason. Anyway, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you about the role of borders in the process of nation building in the last decades of the Habsburg monarchy. So my talk looks at the often imaginative strategies by which different activists tried to establish national claims to territory in mental maps of the region that I call Habsburg Central Europe. This project looked very different in the two halves of the dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary. And only in Austria, only in the Austrian side, was it fully initiated from the point of view of civil society. As most of you probably know, Hungary considered itself a nation state anyway, and here it was often official government agencies that tried to expand ethnically Magyar territory by nationalizing peoples. So in Hungary, the issue was always the degree of success of government nationalization programs, what was working, what wasn't working, as was measured through census language use statistics over time. And I think for the same reason, the Serb, Romanian, Slovak, or German national organizations were more concerned with cultural defense than with setting territorial borders. But in the Austrian half of the dual monarchy, civil society organizations and their activists initiated highly ambitious programs of territorial nationalization. These programs, oops, went too far. These programs developed by a trial and error method over decades. They tried to establish, clarify, and legitimate borders to outline what they claimed was their national territory or national property. And I just have to say, I've always thought these nationalists, they didn't just do it. It was incredibly hard work, and they tried a lot of things that failed. And we have to also, if we want to give them any credit, we sort of have to give them credit for keeping trying and for their imaginations. They also sought to popularize these borders among the public, which was often very difficult. Their programs functioned outside of government institutions, but, as we will see, they drew heavily on imperial resources to make and popularize their claims. And although the imperial regime treated these efforts with some suspicion, seeing them as potentially disruptive to the social order, government bodies at the municipal or even regional level often supported these efforts. In Austria, the government classified nationalist organizations legally as non-political, which is fascinating because they were anything but. Their agendas were incredibly political. But their legal status gave the national organizations the space to mobilize more people into their activities, and especially to open their doors to women activists. Now, for those among you who are sane enough not to study the Habsburg Empire, let me add that until the First World War, nationalists did not generally seek to create independent states or to secede from the Habsburg monarchy. That's sort of a myth that for some reason won't go away. Instead, they wanted to establish the popular character of their national communities so that they could obtain greater administrative autonomy for their territories and this was important, a greater share of public resources and welfare money for their national communities. By 1910, or often earlier, it was apparent that many nationalists had even built up their own smaller empires, so to speak, within the bigger Habsburg Empire. Czech, German, Italian, Polish, Slovene nationalists effectively infiltrated different levels of local and regional administration, thanks to the influence of their political parties, when it came to appointing local officials, so that the political parties had so much influence in deciding who was put into an important official job that those jobs often locally did become nationalized, even though they weren't supposed to. In this way, a non-state program nevertheless became connected to state organs at the municipal and crown land levels. The establishment of national territory required the formation of national frontiers. Where is the nation? This task was made difficult by two facts. First of all, in both Austria and Hungary, several internal borders, as you can see from this slightly misleading map, already existed. Borders that outlined territories that had originally made up the composite state back in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The elites in many of these historical regions often referred to themselves as nations. The noble and church elites that dominated the regional legislatures, or diets, considered themselves to be the nation, and most of you know this. Many of the efforts that I describe here involved imposing a very different definition of nationhood from this older traditional one. The newer definition rested on ideas about peoples and their distinctive cultures, rather than on history and social status. And later, I'll discuss the second fact that made national territories difficult to achieve, and that was the way that several linguistic groups often occupied the same regions. So just to point out the obvious, if you look at this map, you're looking at the traditional crown land division of the empire. So what the nationalists need to do is create all new borders that are for nations and make people forget about these older borders. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to outline what I call a science of borders from below. And by this, I mean tools and strategies developed by activists to assert and popularize the idea that nationhood lived in the very nature of peoples and cultures, and not in historical administrative regions. This concept of nationhood required, obviously, a very different understanding of space. It required the territorialization of an ethnic concept of nationhood. Sometimes that meant equating the ethnic nation with a historic territory, as with Czech nationalism in Bohemia. That's, of course, territory number one up there. Or Polish nationalism in Galicia, or Italian nationalism in the littoral. But more often, it required normalizing new kinds of borders. To accomplish this, nationalists encouraged people to adopt daily life practices that would create, internalize, and reflect the reality of nationhood in their lives. And this is a big task, if you think about it. Convincing people in their everyday lives to see national space through new imagined borders presented a range of scientific and practical challenges. These new borders were neither legal, administrative, nor institutionally recognized. They did not influence daily life practices. They were unfamiliar. They could only be found in the mind, in new kinds of maps produced by nationalist organizations, and I'll show you some later, and in endless streams of highly aggressive rhetoric produced by new nationalist media. The fact that these borders were imagined did not make them any less real for their proponents. But the commitment to make them real created the need to provide scientifically based arguments in their favor. And the science behind establishing these new territorial borders between nations, that science developed out of a bricolage of strategies and technologies, many of them borrowed, stolen, from the imperial state itself, and from opportunities offered by developing media and changing patterns of personal consumptions. So, sorry to keep repeating this, but we have to keep in mind that the nationalists face a dual challenge. The purpose of their science was to make claims on the imperial state, but it was also to popularize the very concept of national property for the populations of those territories and of the people across the empire who weren't simply in those specific territories. So part of it is about, first we have to get the people in our own community to even believe that they belong to this nation, and then we have to get all the people in the other parts of the empire who we think belong to this nation to see that they belong to a single nation. Almost, I would say, an impossible challenge. After the demise of the imperial state in 1918, nationalists on all sides invoked elements of this same science to make new claims on the international community regarding the proposed borders of the successor states. When Hitler later on said, quote, "make these lands German again," unquote, referring to southern Styria in today's Slovenia, the "again" part of his sentence referred to 19th century German nationalist mental maps that had claimed that region for a German nation. So, here are 4 critical points. 1, what I'm calling a science of borders was above all a product of social activism. It was not the product of purely intellectual endeavor or of some theory, although it used developments in technology and ethnography. Hundreds of initiatives of trial and error efforts from within civil society across the empire worked to territorialize cultural nationhood in the popular mind and to demand its legitimation from the imperial state. These initiatives developed in a range of settings. It isn't simply in urban settings or at universities that this happens. They required conceptualizing the nation in terms of different scales of territories and publics, from the village to the province to the region to the empire. Number 2, although initiated from below, these efforts piggybacked on technologies of imperial rule to realize their ambitions. Of course, they used these technologies in ways that their originators had not anticipated. They were terribly imaginative in this. Concepts of nationhood developed in intimate relationship to technologies of imperial rule and knowledge gathering. And this shouldn't surprise anyone. The civil society activists who promoted new meanings of nationhood operated within parameters set by imperial institutions, laws, and administrative practice. Those institutions and practices inevitably shaped the character of nationalist claims and arguments. And actually, you could say the same thing for another alternative nationalist strategy that also developed during this period and that I will completely ignore and leave out of consideration. And that is the very important socialist development of the idea of non-territorial national divisions. But it's non-territorial, so we're not going to think about it. Thirdly, whether or not these strategies succeeded in normalizing new borders in the public mind, they also produced profound anxieties among nationalists about the porousness of these borders. After all, this whole idea was designed to firm up territorial claims with some degree of permanence. But these borders often had the opposite effect. In the abstract, and ultimately these borders are complete abstractions, they gained increasing popular recognition, okay? But the very same nationalist activism that tried to make those borders permanent in the popular mind also taught a very different implicit lesson, that the enemy could breach these normalized walls at any time. These borders were never beyond dispute, and usually they were under threat. The threat might come from the neighboring nation, but more often, however, nationalist publications warned about the threats that were posed by people's weak commitment to their national community. You might say their indifference. To ensure a border's permanence required an impossible and inhuman level of committed activism in one's everyday life practices by the people who lived in these territories. As Jeremy King always reminds me, you can never be nationalist enough for nationalists. When those people in the territories didn't display that level of commitment, the nationalists indulged in a terribly deep pessimism. Nationalist rhetoric repeated a painful cycle. The enemy victimized the nation thanks to people's lack of commitment. But The victimization eventually motivated people to behave more nationally. But then success allowed people to abandon the nationalist commitment, and the victimization would happen all over again. The cycle continued. Number 4, long after the empire collapsed in 1918, these same ideas and strategies continued to shape nationalist territorial claims and rhetoric regarding nationhood, especially in a context that validated the idea of national statehood or nation states. These old territorial claims were the basis for arguments about where to place state borders, certainly from 1918 through 1941. These points that I'm giving you may not seem new, and many of the panels here in the past few days have made many of these arguments using different sites, scales, and levels of analysis. But there is another unwelcome factor that I should mention. Increasingly, today, governments are promoting a methodological nationalism that interprets everything as a kind of prehistory of the nation state. It is very hard to contradict methodological nationalism when the state itself legislates and uses its budgets to control what scientists can write and teach and think, what words are in or out of favor, what concepts can be spoken openly. Critical scholarship on nationhood and ethnicity matters today, I would say, more than ever. 25 years ago, I would have said, well, it's not so important, it's nationalism isn't so important, but I would have been completely wrong. Because of powerful official efforts to erase histories that are not congenial to the narratives that governments, especially my own, wish to promote. If you are from Florida, you know what I'm saying. So our subject, unfortunately, occupies the center of a lot of radical political conflict. But back to the science of borders. This was a product of newer concepts of nationhood, as I said before, that had developed in the first half of the 19th century. I'm a historian, so I have to go there, and exploded onto the political public stage in 1848. 25 to 30 years later, as more men gained the right to vote for the imperial Austrian parliament, this newer concept of nationhood served the needs of several political movements. A combination of mass politics and nationhood became unstoppable in the world of politics. But you need both parts, the mass politics as well as the nationalism. And here I'll just interrupt myself to remind us that this political mobilization on nationalist terms was by no means inevitable. That older association of the term nation with an elite also meant that in some regions, popular sentiment actually was highly anti-national. An extreme example of popular rejection of nationhood would be the behavior of those Galician peasants who massacred the Polish gentry during a nationalist rebellion in 1846. I know this is a bit controversial, but this is my version. Here, peasants appeared to prefer the rule of a Habsburg emperor to the depredations of the hated local nationalist nobility. During the revolutions of 1848, only 2 years later, however, popular and elite discourses associated nation with whole populations. In many, but not all regions, language use came to define national populations. In some regions, it was also religious practice. Hungary, of course, as always, as usual, offers something of an exception. On the one hand, Hungarian nationalists in 1848 did consider all people in Hungary to be part of the nation. On the other hand, some in Hungary who did use other languages often had other ideas and rebelled against the Hungarian revolutionaries. Still, 1848 marks a convenient moment when cultural concepts of nationhood displaced the others, thanks to the sudden eruption of popular politics. Because Culture in this sense is about everybody, not an elite. Nationhood was a political issue, and this is clear from the ways that politicians made it central to their programs. After the defeat of the Revolution of 1848, the new imperial regime nevertheless adopted several elements of the revolution, including legal and practical equalization of many languages that had been proposed by the short-lived Austrian Parliament of 1848. The focus of the revolutionaries and their parliament on restructuring the empire to better accommodate the needs of its different nations left considerable after effects. Social and cultural diversity became objects of intense imperial study in the decades after the revolution. The commitment of the absolutist regime of the 1850s to promote capitalist and infrastructural development also created discussions about the differences between the many regions, and then about the differences among peoples. One writer who studied the spread of capitalist relations wrote enthusiastically, for example, that, quote, Oriental conditions are coming to an end in Hungary, end quote, implying that Hungary was becoming more similar to Bohemia or Lower Austria. When this growing interest in linguistic and social differences became associated with imagined civilizational differences or different levels of civilization among peoples, most writers explained these civilizational differences in economic and social terms, and that's important. It wasn't about backward civilizations. It was about regions that were believed to be economically backward. There is a difference. The cohesiveness of the empire depended increasingly on its ability to raise up and equalize all its peoples. So the older traditional challenge to the Habsburg state building since the mid-1700s had always been, how do we unify all these regions under common legal codes and institutions? In a kind of ironic turnaround, this official exploration and recognition of cultural difference in the 1850s became a new aspect of state building and imperial legitimation. The most influential ideologist, and here's the map you all know, the most influential ideologist of empire during this period was the civil servant, statistician, and I'm American, ethnographer Karl von Czernik. As director of the Office of Administrative Statistics for the Commerce Ministry, Czernik undertook a massive ethnographic study of Austria's population, published 1855-1857. He created colorful maps, and his are the most beautiful aesthetically, I think. Colorful maps, and we'll see some uglier ones coming up, to represent the geographic presence of different ethnic and linguistic groups. His purpose, and this is important, was to show that thanks to internal migration and economic transformation, every crown land was going to be linguistically heterogeneous. Czernik argued that no single language group could claim the territory of any administrative unit. Territorial separation of Austria's peoples was therefore impossible. And this point also was a foundation for the ideas of non-territorial autonomy that were developed later that I'm going to ignore. But 25 years after this map, the nationalists used his maps to try to prove an opposite point. Not only could they use language maps to claim specific territories, but they could also develop strategies to win more territory or to prevent their own dilution by other nations. Ultimately, I think, this is just my opinion, when we view the Czernik map today, and here's a very sort of almost barbaric version of it on the left, we can't help seeing the successor states in vague outline. And somebody made us see that, I would say. Okay, so back in 1848, the deputies to the imperial parliament had debated whether to reorganize the empire using administrative districts that were drawn according to the language of their inhabitants. Czech nationalist deputies had argued for this linguistic division, but most deputies agreed that you couldn't do that because it would trap some language islands in some districts organized around another language. So in the end, they kept the traditional administrative borders. But the issue of districts organized on language use got considerable attention, as did the constitutional demand for language equalization. When the Austrian parliament 20 years later drafted a new constitution in 1867, it returned to the guarantees of 1848 and made equalization of language in schooling and administration a constitutional right. It also created a special court to hear complaints from people who believed that their linguistic rights had been violated, which is sort of amazing when you think about it. These guarantees made nationalist issues into a profitable cause for politicians. Because once a constitution makes a guarantee like that, politicians can always argue for its broader implementation in society. It's like, well, you've guaranteed this, but here are all these ways in which it should be applied to society, and it isn't. The reformers of 1867 did not redraw the administrative borders by language use. But the idea remained popular among nationalists in some regions, especially Germans in Bohemia. The other factor that helped to increase nationalist concern for territory and numbers was the expansion of the electorate. By 1897, there was universal manhood suffrage, and in 1906, the system of curial voting was abolished for parliament. If a political movement hoped to survive the expansion of the electorate, well, it had to find issues that would motivate a more socially diverse electorate. And as new social groups entered politics, all the parties developed increasingly radical positions to demonstrate their commitment to the nation against their rivals. I mean, that kind of polarization, even within a national community, creates incredible radicalization. By the 1890s, a range of officially non-political mass nationalist organizations had also entered the picture. And these organizations took nationalist issues well beyond the demands of politics. They tried to mobilize people for a range of daily life nationalist practices, including recognizing the boundaries of the national territories. I would say that the empire's biggest contribution to this territorialization was a key change that it made to the decennial census. For the 1880 census, the administration added a question that asked after a person's language of daily use. Not wishing to increase nationalist agitation, the administration did not ask for a person's mother tongue, as they did in Hungary, or a person's nationality. Of course, it didn't make any difference. Thanks to the international standards, the way that the census was taken and the way that it was translated into language maps like the one on the left of the empire favored nationalist projects by clearly delineating national borders. Respondents could only list one language, and the census did not measure multilingualism. Hard linguistic boundaries seem to separate people in regions where two language communities often came together. Map makers simplified Austria-Hungary's linguistic makeup because, okay, so what you're actually seeing here is the statistical plurality, not even a majority, of a language in any given district. That was what determined its color on the map. So if a district recorded that 51% people spoke one language and 49% used the other, the map essentially erases the 49% completely, making the districts and regions seem more homogeneously monolingual than they actually are. Activists had other strategies at their disposal too, for shaping how the observer would read a map. An obvious strategy is you use a dominant dark color for the good nation and a very pale color for the neighboring nation. So Here you see a German nationalist map in which the Czech group is in a sort of whitish yellow that's barely recognizable. A more interesting strategy, I think, was to depict population density in different regions. So here in this map of Western Bohemia, for example, Czech nationalists used population density to depict the German majority regions as actually smaller than they might have seemed, making them appear much less impressive, while depicting the Czech majority regions as a single block without the density measure. By the way, these maps came from Peter Haslinger's wonderful book on territorialization of the Czech nation, but also I think Holly Case's book, Between States, has really good analysis of these same strategies used for Transylvania in the interwar period. Nationalists now had detailed language statistics from all the regions and localities at their disposal, and these statistics helped them to plot the territorial location of their nation down to the smallest village. Data from later censuses, 1890, 1900, 1910, allowed nationalists to locate where the borders had changed, or rather, where they had advanced or retreated. Now, advance and retreat, in this sense, are military terms, and nationalists used highly militarized language to describe the census results. Their publications spoke of frontiers, but also of front lines, fortresses, or defensive positions in the local landscape, like rivers like the Drava or Sava rivers in Styria, for example, which became potential natural boundaries between opposing militarized nations. A good defense requires a good offense wherever possible. Put the enemy on the defensive. Extend bridgeheads beyond the borders into the enemy's territory. For nationalists in Austria, this generally meant building private minority schools in districts where there were too few children to qualify for a state-funded school in the minority language. After all, we study nationalism and ethnicity, we know that it's always about children. They are the future. Schools were about youth. You could train youth to be the new, more committed future generation. But youth also can cause nationalists some anxiety. Nationalists emphasized that cultural differences between nations were almost unbridgeable, almost. They described their own cultures in detail to make them seem as radically different from those of neighboring cultures or nations as possible. And this is so weird because then when you actually look into what village culture might have looked like in a multilingual region, you can't say for any certainty who's what or which building style belongs to which nation or which agricultural fields belong to one nation or another. But nationalists are arguing that you can. The more extreme the difference, the more you could convince potential members of the national community of their own identity as part of the nation. Arguments about extreme difference also make it easier to claim increased political autonomy. We need more officials fluent in the national language and greater political recognition. But on the other hand, as many of you know from your own work, people's daily life behaviors rarely conformed to what nationalists wanted them to be. Local, regional, religious, economic, and social commitments drew people in many different directions, often away from the stern demands of national belonging. And this was especially problematic when it came to schools. Parents often made choices for their child's education that contradicted nationalist goals. They may have wanted their child to know the provincial second language in order to improve their employment chances or their chances for social mobility, even if they were nationalists. In border regions of Bohemia, as you may have read in the wonderful book by Tara Zara, Kidnapped Souls, parents often sent their children to different schools in alternate years. Even more typical, however, were the exchanges in agricultural regions, where children would live with families who used the other language during the summer months. And I think it's hardly a coincidence that one of the men responsible for theorizing that thing I wasn't going to talk about, non-territorial autonomy, socialist Karl Renner, had himself experienced such an exchange as a child. And these kinds of practices muddied the question of borders. Would the children exposed to such practices desert their authentic nation and join a rival nation? Nationalists also contradicted their claims about extreme cultural differences when they tried to attract children of the other nation to their own school with a range of bribes. At the same time, and for reasons that contradicted claims about authentic nationhood or these insurmountable cultural barriers, nationalists feared that children could too easily be denationalized. So on the one hand, the cultures are so radically different that there's no possible exchange among them. On the other hand, there's a fear that they're too similar and children could go from one to another. Nationalist organizations sought to shore up borders with other policies as well. From supporting local economies to preventing members, oh, by the way, this is a lovely picture of a literary collection where you see the Czech school in the background that's protecting the Czech children from the evil Germanization dragon. All kinds of organizations help the local economy, prevent members of the nation from migrating. In one important case, a German nationalist organization even raised money, not enough, to settle so-called colonists on land bought from Slovene farmers in South Styria. They hoped, in this way, to redraw the national borders by connecting the German language island that was the city of Marburg or Maribor to the German inhabited territory to the north of the Drava River. And they billed this project as a radical initiative to accomplish what states could not accomplish. And actually, I think Hitler's reference to make this land German again refers a lot to this kind of project. Anyway, here you see the culmination of a range of projects in attempting to shift and strengthen a cultural border between nations in a multilingual province like Styria. How this organization determined where to buy the farms and where to place the colonists and who to choose as colonists for settlement depended greatly on their close study of census statistics from the region, the science of borders. And still, as it turned out, even those settlers often disappointed the nationalists by socializing with their Slovene neighbors, often intermarrying with them and becoming what the nationalists would call denationalized. To popularize and propagandize these efforts, several nationalist authors wrote about life on these national borders. A range of men and women novelists described life in border regions where contact between nations was unavoidable. And here you have sort of stock male and female characters in the novels navigating the inevitable road from their indifference to their proud national commitment. I mean, we're talking third to fourth rate literature here, but it's sometimes fun to read them. Having read quite a few, I can say that. At the same time, nationalist newspapers developed that reported imperial news, I would say pretty straightforwardly, but framed local incidents and news in terms of an ongoing struggle between nations. In their reports, they reinforced the tropes of victimization, as well as referring regularly to the allegedly well-known borders that ought to have separated the nations more effectively. By 1910, a range of consumer goods and tourism guidebooks also advertised their qualities in terms of their services to the nation. However, did people actually make much use of them? Probably not. By the way, I have to also include the Sokol Gymnastics Association. Here's a Sokol flag and a postcard advertising the big interregional Sokol sled in Brno in 1914. Now, there's not enough time, luckily for you, for me to detail all of these efforts, and nor can I say anything about the way that nationalists, both the victors and the vanquished, made continued use of these strategies after 1918. By the way, that Czech nationalist map of Western Bohemia, for example, sorry, this one, was actually published in the year 1920. And why? Its purpose was to motivate Czech colonists to leave their homes and consider settling in the border regions of the new nation-state of Czechoslovakia in order to dilute the German presence there. On the other hand, the Czech nationalists mixed this ethnic argument with their insistence on maintaining the historic, not ethnic, borders of the Kingdom of Bohemia. So depending on the situation, nationalists could invoke a range of different and often contradictory borders without apparently damaging their cause. Now, you could argue that nationalists succeeded brilliantly in their efforts to normalize specific borders, whether or not they ever realized those borders in legal terms. In popular mental terms, I would say these borders became normalized for many people for many generations. And at least, I would say, 25, 30 years ago, it was not difficult to encounter people in some of these regions who would talk about these borders as if they were the real borders. Of course, the ethnic cleansing of many of these regions during and after the Second World War only reinforced these mental borders. But if we ask about the practical success or failure of these nationalist initiatives to actually move or defend these borders before 1918, we can at least turn to one slightly biased expert for an unbiased conclusion. And this will be my conclusion as well. German nationalist statistician Heinrich Rauchberg oversaw the 1890 census in Imperial Austria. It was the first census that used machinery for counting. So he knew a little bit about what he was doing. In his massive 2-volume study of German national property, Die Nationale Besitzstand in Böhmen, which also considered Czech national property as well, 1905, he concluded that taking all these factors together, the activism, like taking all the factors of economic transformation, internal migration, everything, the actual activism of the nationalists in the previous 25 years had not affected the territorialization of language use to any noticeable extent. Thank you very much for your attention at the end of this long day.
Thank you, Peter, for this fascinating, exciting, and also entertaining speech and lecture. I'm sure that you answered many questions, but I'm sure that the audience have some questions. So we have approximately 20 minutes for a Q&A. Yeah. Do you need both? Or maybe you can just take both?
Well, you need one.
I need one. Okay, I need one.
I'm going to go back to my favorite picture.
Yes, please. First, second.
Hello, Evgeny Varshaver, my name. So my question is, you currently use the term nationalists in your lecture.
Yes.
And how can you distinguish between those whom you call nationalists and the rest of politicians or activists or whatever? Thank you.
That is an excellent question because I have homogenized the nationalists in using that term. So just as within any nationalism, there are several versions. Of course, there are several types of people who at different moments make use of nationalism for, in my opinion, largely political purposes. I think in the cases I was discussing, most of these politicians had to identify themselves in a nationalist way all the time. But your point is important because they defined their own nation, who was part of the nation, who was not part of the nation, often in very different ways. For me, for example, one of the most interesting is within Bohemia, the German nationalists very much disagreed amongst themselves about whether Jews could be members of their nation. And many of them argued that Jews ought to be members, and many of them argued that they should not. That's just one small example. I would also add that, of course, the use of nationalism is a highly situational one in politics, and therefore, as historians, I think we usually want to ask, what is the situation in which the nationalism is expressed in this particular way, or brought up, or used in a particular way, rather than simply presuming that across the board it's always there. So, yes, you've, in a very important way, undermined a lot of what I was saying, in a way that I would find absolutely acceptable.
Hello, so I have a question more about the administrative side of the Habsburg Empire. I remember, yes, I remember a quote from your fantastic book on the history of the Habsburg Empire, in which you argued, or you say that by 1848, only two parts of the empire had kind of rejected the imperial authority. Yeah. One side was like northern Italy, so Lombardy, Venetia, and on the other side it was Hungary. Yeah. But then what I wanted to, like when I read that sense, I immediately thought, why then, because for Italy it makes kind of sense what has then developed into the Italian process of unification of the nation. But then why Hungary stayed in? Is it only because of the negotiation that led to the Ausgleich, or it's because in some ways, in 1848, nationalism was, in that sense, was more of a progressive idea, and then degenerated into what we all know and your lesson. So that's my reflection on it.
I would offer a third alternative that will, unfortunately, make sense to all of us today, and that is the Russian intervention. The defeat of the willingness of the Ausgleich itself, the settlement happens largely because Hungarian independence was defeated militarily, and then in the after effects treated quite brutally, at least in the first years of the 1850s. So in that sense, I also would say, maybe others would argue with me, that when I say Italian nationalists and Hungarian nationalists, that's who I mean. I don't necessarily mean common people who are living in Lombardy or Veneto, and also, of course, the Hungarian Revolution, as I tried to say, also precipitated other revolutions against the Hungarian Revolution as well. I mean, it's hard because it's difficult to do this properly, but when we're talking about revolution, we're talking about the people who made the revolution. You know, peasants wanted basically the end of serfdom. They weren't thinking about nationhood, and they often expressed it that way. So we have to remember the limits as well, and as opposed to the big numbers.
Hi, and thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. My question has to do with the administrative units themselves, and whether at some point and under what conditions would the administrative units themselves start co-opting these nationalist outlooks and carrying out parallel nationalizing processes? Thank you.
That is a superb question. And I don't want to try to give you a 10-hour answer that details the bizarre history of the administrative units, or as I'm sure you all know in great detail, there is what was called a two-track system of administration. locally. One was elected officials in the municipalities who had quite a bit of say over the local economic development, welfare, this kind of thing. The other was a track appointed from above that was in the same administrative district that was to look after the more imperial issues and to make sure that the municipalities didn't do anything that was too extreme or radical. But what happened was that because of the power of the nationalist political parties in the parliament, and we're talking, or in the diets as well, by the end of the 19th century, in some of these crown lands, they were appointing people to official positions who were themselves nationalist. And often local people would say, we want you, I mean, this is so crazy, we want you to appoint the pharmacist who speaks this language because we all speak this language. So in an odd way, this anti-national bureaucracy had at some levels become quite nationalized by 1900. The province where I mentioned Bohemia because I think it was the most extreme there, but I think it's the case in many of the crown lands. So it was, in a sense, I mean, the empire, as you know, has this ideology that the administration is above politics. But by the end, politics was everywhere. And so local administrators were often nationalists. And this also determines how they treat local incidents where people beat each other up in a pub or something. Who gets punished? Who doesn't get, you know, this kind of thing. So it's a very important question that makes us ask, well, what really is the state? Right? Is the state this place in Budapest and Vienna with one set of rules? Is the state the local town government with a very different set of rules?
Thank you for your brilliant presentation. I wanted to ask, how do you think, why did some of the nationalist activists, anthropologists, ethnographers, and so on from the Habsburg Empire, why did some of them success at the Paris Peace Conference and the other fail, like for example, Ukrainian activists?
Yeah. Actually, they succeeded or failed for several reasons that had, in the end, I think, little to do with their own effectiveness. They succeeded or failed because of the military situation on the ground, and they succeeded or failed because of who was given access to the main negotiators. So, as you probably know, Woodrow Wilson, who was completely ignorant of everything in Eastern Europe, we know this thanks to the charming book by Larry Wolff about this question. He, for example, knew Masaryk and Paderewski really well. And they convinced him, as you know from this book, that he could be the Abraham Lincoln kind of emancipator of Eastern Europe, and the idea of, and they fed him their opinions on where the border should be drawn. But in the end, it isn't even really Wilson that has that much of a decision here. It's really the military and who has influence. As you might know, I'm sure you know better than I do, there was a Ukrainian deputation that was really prevented from participating openly at the Paris Peace Conference. And I think Alison Frank, she in her book on Galicia has a very good section on that, on what happened in Paris and why Ukraine, or I shouldn't say Ukraine, I should say the people representing the different Ukrainian states were not given much access to the discussions. But the decisions, of course, also depended a lot on who had a military where. And we should remember that as well. Even though all of these, like all the German nationalists and the Magyar nationalists also tried to get their opinions across at the peace conference, it wasn't, it didn't work the way we're told it worked. Does that answer your, yeah.
Um, so in my own research right now, I'm kind of looking at ethnic organizations in the United States, and I'm interested in them contemporarily, primarily. But of course, you look into the history, and you know, I find it fascinating because a lot of these like borrow some of the direct names from like these nationalist organizations in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like for example, like so-called gymnastics is there's a Chicago branch founded in like 1896. So at this similar time. So I guess my question is, I suppose, in this very far away from the sort of contested borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like what is the role, I suppose, that they serve, or the usefulness in, I guess, adopting these same sort of national organizational principles, I suppose?
That's a really interesting question. A couple of historians, I think, have done interesting work on that. I know Christina Poznan's dissertation on Hungarians is really helpful, but I see a couple of things that are contradictory that go on with the creation of these organizations. One is, it's often been argued that people became nationalized to their nation back in Austria-Hungary once they got to the United States. In other words, by joining these local social organizations, they developed a kind of, let's say, Czech nationalist consciousness that they didn't have when they were living in, say, Bohemia or Moravia. I think these organizations obviously had a role to help immigrant communities to organize themselves, sort of like self-help organizations, the way they had in different contexts back in Europe. But what the meaning of those things were, because I've also read that, for example, often German-speaking Bohemians join some of these Czech nationalist organizations and come to see themselves as Czech nationalists. But first of all, because they all came from the same region, they all joined the same club. This goes back to, I think the work that really started, certainly inspired my work, was Gary Cohen's book about the Germans in Prague and how because back then in 1980, I was actually alive then, we all believed that, of course, if you spoke this language, you were this kind of nationalist, and that was that. And Cohen showed that the presence or absence of social organizations like this was what had actually created these identifications. Now, I would almost laugh at myself from 1980 because it seems so obvious. But I think these organizations have very specific purposes for socializing people in the new context, giving them an identity the way other immigrants have identities, but also giving them a social context that's really important in a new country. And again, that also gives them a national identity that they may not have had before. But it's a really interesting topic and question. And it's important today, too.
Privilege status here on the stage to ask you a totally unfair question.
Sure.
I'm sorry for it. I mean, just like
no, there should
this is the last keynote speech at this conference. It's Friday. So, Pieter, you mentioned a lot, and you also in your publications discuss a lot failed efforts to nationalize, failed efforts to mobilize, or create a national consciousness or mind. Now, and you have wonderful examples using the historian's microscope. But let's now just like zoom out a little bit, and can you just speculate about if you noticed any patterns? I know it's not, this is an exercise probably not historians don't necessarily like. That is, what are the patterns? Have you noticed any patterns, any context in which nationalization often succeeds or fails? So what are the conditions for national mobilizers, national entrepreneurs, or nationalist entrepreneurs to succeed or fail? Have you noticed anything that is, that determines the success of such efforts?
Well, the question of success or failure is a tricky question, right? What would success actually mean to a nationalist activist? I mean, to some people it might be a recognition of a certain form of autonomy. To other people it might mean ethnic cleansing of a region. So success is a relative thing, obviously. What strikes me about the examples here is that a society or a group of nationalists who are who have links to a strong middle class, a strong economic, I mean, this is obvious, right? Are going to succeed better. But I wouldn't make that a rule either. I mean, I think if you look at the rise of a Ukrainian nationalism within the Habsburg monarchy, you'd obviously get a quite different picture. In the long run, I would say nationalism succeeds because nation statehood becomes valorized as the best and only way of organizing states, creating a horribly barbaric 20th century, but for some reason we still believe nation states organized around ethnic nations are like the best. So I can't give you an answer that isn't maybe attached to a narrower definition of success or failure. Sorry, that's my way out. I think we all, I mean, there were lots of talks about various conditions that produce successes, literacy, creation of nationalist media, patterns of consumption. But I think we ought to see, too, that success and failure are very relative terms. Nation itself is a relative term. So, sorry.
No, that was a very elegant
I
way of
it.
Yeah, and okay. Any more questions, or maybe we have time for one maximum? Okay. So there was, again, Pieter, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for attending. Now, I hope you all had a very productive conference. Obviously, just, no conclusions. But as Pieter mentioned in his presentation, issues of nationalism, nationhood, nationalist politics are as important today as ever, or even more important, definitely more important than 25 years ago, which is, well, some bittersweet news for us. Most of us as scholars and students in nationalism, well, I mean, we have stuff to work on. We are relevant. As for citizens, I hope, or I guess most of us are not as happy as scholars with the rise or reemergence of nationalism. Now we have one more speaker left, a surprise guest who is not on the schedule, to make an announcement.
Oh, bonjour. I trust you've all had an enlightening and invigorating conference here in beautiful Budapest. I am the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph CS, though you might simply call me CS. If my name rings a bell, it might be because I once wrote a little pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? I like to think it caused a bit of a stir. You see, I've always believed in the transformative power of ideas, especially those that link the people to their own power. Nationalism, freedom, democracy. A complicated trio to be sure, but I dare to imagine they could coexist. That a nation could be truly free because it belonged to its people and governed by their will. Now, I must confess, we didn't quite get everything right in the 1790s. A few missteps. But the questions remain urgent. How can nationalism empower without excluding? How can freedom be shared, not hoarded? And how can democracy thrive in an age of disinformation and division? Which brings me to the future. I am delighted to announce that next year's conference in 2026 will take place in Edinburgh, the proud capital of Scotland. And the theme? Why none other than nationalism, freedom, and democracy. A subject close to my revolutionary heart, and I suspect to many of yours. So prepare your papers, sharpen your arguments, and perhaps pack a scarf. Edinburgh awaits. Until then, vive la pensée critique and safe travels home.